Hello, welcome to a video lecture that I prepared for you on podcasting and how it relates to this assignment that we're working on, the profile essay, which we're then converting to a podcast, so to speak. Basically, we're creating an audio file out of your profile essay. We won't be uploading it to the internet, so technically it's not actually podcast because we're not broadcasting it. And we're doing everything kind of just short of that. And so the better you understand podcasting, I think the better you'll understand this assignment. Okay, so the first question I had for you guys, actually it's two questions on this slide. Do you listen to podcasts? If not, why not? They're out there, they're available, they cover a wide range of topics. And so there's probably something that you're interested in that there's a podcast out there about that. So if you do listen to podcasts, be interested in hearing what some of your favorites are. And I'll see if I can set up a discussion board for you guys to contribute some podcasts that you might listen to. And we can compose a class list. I have created a list of recommended podcasts on our D2L site. And so I'd encourage you to become familiar with some of those. And I'm going to talk about some of those here in a little bit. Okay, so we're talking about podcasts. So what are podcasts? Basically, podcasting is a simple process of creating and editing an audio file and then posting it to a hosting site. We try to export this file as an MP3 file because MP3 is a good compression algorithm, and without losing any audio quality, or at least not too much. And so as long as you have a program that will allow you to create an audio file and then edit it, you are pretty close to being able to create a podcast. Once you have this audio file, you can go to a podcast hosting site. There's one that I'm familiar with is Libsyn, but there are a bunch of others out there. And then set up an account and for your podcast, and then you'll upload episodes to that account, and you'll get a feed for your overall podcast. And then each episode of the podcast will also have a separate feed. And the feed, you can then share it with iTunes. You can basically let them know that you have a podcast and here's where to find it. And once you do that, it will show up in iTunes lists of podcasts. They'll put it in a particular category, and other people will be able to find it and subscribe to it. So this term subscribe, it's oftentimes we think of subscribing to something as involving money, magazine subscription, premium cable channel subscription, other types of subscriptions. But in podcasting, in the world of podcasting, subscribing to a podcast just means that you've kind of signed up to receive the feed, and there's no money involved. So users subscribe to the podcast feeds using a podcast aggregator like iTunes. And then when you go into your library of podcasts and you hit refresh, it's telling iTunes to go out and search all these feeds for podcasts that you're subscribed to, and then see if there are any new episodes, and then alert you that there are new episodes. It'll show that there's something available to download, and you can click on it, and you have the latest episode at that point. So, okay, why podcast? Or from a production standpoint or from a consumer standpoint, why listen to podcasts? So podcasts are like free radio programs, covering a wide range of topics. And I think several operative words there: free, and then they're like radio, and then a wide range of topics. So frequently on radio stations, they're limited a little bit by advertising revenue and by viewer or listener ratings. And so if something doesn't generate advertising revenue or ratings or something, they're likely to kill it. And but that's not the case with podcasts. So further down on this slide, I talk about podcasts being cheap and easy to create. So almost anyone with a computer and an internet connection and an audio editing program can create them because they're fairly cheap and easy to create. They're not heavily dependent on advertising revenue. A lot of people do podcasting pretty much as a hobby, something that they enjoy doing. But there are podcasts out there that do try to encourage some advertising to make some money, to make a living, so to speak. So it can be something that you could, make a living off of, or it could be something that's kind of a hobby, or something in between, supplementing your income or something. So also because they're not dependent on advertisers or ratings, they oftentimes open up to more marginalized topics and voices being able to be heard. So instead of kind of the least common denominator, which is what we see a lot on broadcast television, what will appeal to the most people, oftentimes there's a podcast out there that maybe only appeals to a few dozen people, and but there's a podcast. So kind of one of the cool things about podcasts is it gives voice to frequently marginalized voices. So okay, and I mentioned that you can find a podcast on almost any subject. If you go into iTunes and go into their podcasting section and search for a term, you're likely to find a podcast on that topic. So back up to the top here, I did mention that many of them actually are radio programs that are broadcast over the radio and then re-released as podcast episodes. And so basically on NPR, just about every program that they have on NPR, they then also archive it and create a podcast feed for it. And so maybe something was on NPR All Things Considered this morning. Oftentimes, even before noontime, you can find that podcast is available online. So there's a slight delay, but you're not missing out. But in terms of that slight delay and not missing out, one of the advantages of podcasts is you don't have to be there as an audience member at the same time that the radio program is being broadcast. Instead, like I say in my last bullet item here, podcasts allow listeners to listen to programs on their own schedule. So kind of like having a DVR on your television, on your cable. You don't have to be there to watch it when it happens. And you can come back and watch it later. You can pause it. If you don't like it, you can just stop watching it and move on to the next podcast episode or something. And they're highly portable. So whether you have them on your smartphone, or if you still have an iPod or some other type of device like that, you can carry podcasts around with you. And in fact, that's where the name comes from, is in relation to the iPod, that these were intended to be things that you would put on your iPod and then carry around and listen to. So, okay, moving along. I mentioned iTunes can be used as a podcast aggregator to subscribe to podcast feeds and check for new episodes. And as I already mentioned, the wide range of programs available. So let's go take a look at iTunes and their selection of podcasts available on iTunes. Okay, so here we are in iTunes and into the podcast section. So we're in the iTunes store, and I somehow found my way into the podcast section. I forgot exactly how I got here. But you'll see some things scrolling across the top, and these are kind of featured podcasts. The one that we're seeing about to disappear here, Serial. They follow a particular story that's maybe it's not exactly in the news, but it's newsworthy, and oftentimes it's a series of episodes over 12 weeks or 16 weeks or something like that. So frequently it's a story that has some controversy involved with it, and so they kind of lay it out in very detailed and try to get you involved basically for an entire season. So you see some others scrolling across the top here. We also see new and noteworthy, and you can see what's there. You can click on see all and see all of their new and noteworthy podcast. New seasons, these are things that have actually achieved a following, and so they've got some new episodes of that. Scrolling down, we see editor's pick, and so picks, and so we've got several things that the folks at iTunes, kind of acting as curators, have decided that these are worth your attention. Featured collections, I don't know what the difference is between those, but I guess there are, instead of just one podcast, you get a collection of podcasts. And we see fantasy football, brain food, more to explore, featured providers. So, and again, you can scroll through a lot of those. We also see up here at the top podcasts, and that's the section of iTunes that we're in. Categories, so you can see that there's a good number of categories, and maybe you just want to search through some of those. Also, under top episodes, you can see what's popular with people. And so there's Serial right at the top. And there's something from the New York Times on the Supreme Court nomination. And the Joe Rogan Experience. The Daily from the New York Times. Something else from Joe Rogan. Something on NPR. And This American Life, a couple of episodes there. And so then top podcasts, they've got Serial right at the very top. And I'm not sure what Wondery is, or Dr. Death. We see the New York Times, How Stuff Works, Joe Rogan Experience, New York Times Opinion, Conan O'Brien, etc. So, okay. And then you have a search bar up here at the top. And so just about anything you'd want to search for, you can probably find a podcast related to that topic. Okay. And let me go back to my slides and talk about a few other things here. Okay, so I wanted to talk about a few podcasts here. These are some that I've recommended to you guys on D2L, and just spend a few moments talking about them and also listening to them just a little bit. So without the constraints of classroom and such, I can kind of go on at length about this, so pardon me if I do. So if you need to, pause this video lecture at any point, come back to it, and but please do try to watch it all. So Benjamin Walker's Theory of Everything, it was a podcast that has a history with radio, was a show on NPR, and then for whatever reason it got canceled on NPR, and then the guy who creates it, Benjamin Walker, wound up at WFMU radio station in New York, and then he was calling it Too Much Information, and then I guess at some point he got the rights to the name back, so it's back as Benjamin Walker's Theory of Everything. And let's take a look at it in iTunes. Okay, so when you go into iTunes and search for Benjamin Walker's Theory of Everything, we kind of have some breadcrumbs up here that show how it's organized. So it's in podcasts, obviously, Society and Culture, Personal Journals, and Radiotopia is the provider. And then as we look down through this, we see that the episodes, they're kind of about every week or two, but not exactly. And you can also look through this and see that they kind of vary in their overall length. So here's one down here, 1 hour and 6 minutes, but then just a few right above it, 14 minutes. So it all depends on the topic, depending on how long it goes. And so it's a bit unusual, even though this is kind of created as a radio program, that we're not locked into particular lengths of time with podcasts. You can also look through this and see the title of certain episodes. Right now he's doing a 10-part, actually it looks like it's now 11-part series on false alarms. He did a series on Utopia. You also have the description of the show, and you can click on that and see a little bit more information. These are called show notes. So, and there's the subscribe button over here, and you can also see the rating. Pretty good ratings on this. I think that the people who work on this particular podcast do a very good job of it. It's got a lot of polish to it. One of the things I really like about it is that oftentimes there's some music that continues to play in the background through the entire episode, and it just kind of helps to set a mood for things. So the topic of the show has kind of changed over the years, I think. One time it seemed to be like a podcast version of Seinfeld, that not so much with a bunch of characters, but that it was about living in New York City. So he does have some regular guests on his show. One guy is kind of a conspiracy theorist, and it seems like every time he talks to him, it's a phone conversation. We can kind of, hear that it's happening over the phone. But also, I want to play you a little bit of it. We'll hear the beginning. We'll hear the different pre-recorded parts, a few kind of commercials and stuff in there. We hear the introduction to the show, and almost always that's Benjamin Walker's wife who does that. She's French, and so speaks with a very heavy French accent. And then we get into the episode after that. So let me cue up an episode and let you listen to a little bit of the beginning of the episode. Okay, so here I am on the website for the podcast, and you can listen to episodes right here on the website. So I went into episodes. This was a recent one, False Alarm, Part 11. And in this particular one, talking about the vagaries, I guess, between truth and fiction, and that people sometimes don't believe facts. But in this episode, talking about how people are more likely to believe fiction sometimes, that facts and statistical information people frequently brush off, but when you tell a story, people find that compelling and believable. So let me play the first part of this and give you a little taste of what it's like.
This installment is called True Lessons.
You are reaching me at Stanford University. I'm at a conference to look at how disinformation, bad information, bad social media can affect nuclear command and control.
So this interview that we're doing, Jeffrey, actually kicks off part 11 in this epic series that I'm doing on the real and the fake. But the way this thing started way back in episode 1 was with a friend of mine and his wife who told me about what happened to them when the missile alert went off when they were on vacation in Hawaii. And what was amazing to me was that their first instinct was to search for the truth on Twitter.
Well, yeah, that's actually a topic that's come up at this meeting. It turns out the warning systems are incredibly vulnerable to hacking. I guess people send fake evacuation text messages to U.S. troops in South Korea all the time. Like, oh, yeah, like they, official alert, you must evacuate all family members, stuff like that to mess with them, which I totally would have used in the book if I'd known.
Jeffrey Lewis attends a lot of conferences related to nuclear weapons because he is one of the world's leading experts on North Korea's weapons program. And for the past few years, he's been trying to raise awareness as to just how close we are to actual nuclear war. This past summer, he decided to try something new. He wrote a book of fiction. It's called The 2020 Commission, and it's a fake report written in the year 2020 for the United States government by a civil servant named Jeffrey Lewis. The report documents in detail all the events that led to North Korea bombing Seoul, Tokyo, New York, Washington, D.C., and Florida.
So I spend a lot of time trying to explain things on a nonfiction basis to people, and it never works, because I think a lot of times when we read things in nonfiction, a lot of the emotion, which is a real part of a decision-making process, sort of disappears or it fades into the background. It's way easier to show it. It's far easier to just show people things and tell people things as a story. I actually had to write a conference paper for this conference, and it was really hard to switch gears. And I'm kind of a little nervous about my talk this afternoon because I'm worried it's going to be a little shallow.
So you've already been seduced by the power of fiction. But I should point out to the listeners that your book isn't like fiction. You didn't have to speculate that much as to how the United States and North Korea could be pulled into nuclear conflict, because talking about the plausibility of, this exact scenario is what you do in your day job.
Okay, so that gave you a little taste of this podcast. And you kind of heard that little music in the background. It wasn't constant, but it does repeat throughout, and it helps to kind of set a mood here. Also, the person that Benjamin Walker was interviewing, he was on the phone at a conference, and so we got that difference in audio there. And we could go on with this, but if you're looking for a podcast to kind of critically listen to and study, and think about how you could replicate some of the polished effects in your own audio essay, this is a good source to look at. Okay, let's take a listen to some other examples. Okay, so the next podcast I wanted to share with you is called Everything is Alive, and basically kind of treating a lot of inanimate objects as if they were alive, and the host is interviewing these inanimate objects, and the voice for the inanimate objects is usually provided by an actor or comedian. And so these are humorous podcasts to listen to, makes you think a little bit differently, and it's fairly new podcast series. So I want to play you an excerpt from an episode where the host is interviewing an elevator. So let's listen to a couple of minutes of that. Okay, so here I am on the website for the podcast. So you can access it through a website or through iTunes. And let me go down and look at recent episodes. The most recent one, where he interviews a tooth by the name of Paul, I did not find especially compelling, but I really liked at least the first couple of minutes of this interview with Anna the elevator. So let me play a little bit of that for you.
Now they all feel the same to me, but there was definitely a time when, the first time I went to 15, 16, or 17, it was a little bit of a, whoa, I'm going all the way up here. I've never gone this high before. My name is Anna, and I'm an elevator. I remember my first day thinking, okay, first we're gonna go to 5, all right, and then okay, we stop at 3, and then we'll go to 11. And as we got higher, I was getting like anxious, you know, when the button would get pushed, like, oh, I'm going all the way up there, I haven't gone there yet.
You were a little bit scared of heights.
Yeah, I would say I was. I think when you go to the highest floor you've ever been to for the first time, you think it should be no higher than this. They're all gonna feel like maybe they're too high in the beginning, but then you'll get used to it.
What do you imagine an elevator, you know, who's working in the tallest building, what do you imagine they feel?
Probably tired. I mean, I'm tired after a day of work, and I'm just going to 17. But I see all the other buildings they're making are getting higher and higher. You know, Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to make a building that was a mile high.
A mile?
Yeah, and it was going to have 76 elevators. And they were going to be nuclear powered, but it never got built.
It's terrifying in, like, every way. Like,
yeah.
It's too tall. It is powered by the most destructive force man has ever known.
One elevator mishap in that building is gone.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, like, think about what if something went wrong in this elevator, and they're imagining being stuck. They're not imagining, you know, a city being destroyed.
Right. That kind of danger is like, I mean, I'm to be honest, I'm glad it didn't get built.
Okay, so there is Anna, the elevator, and the name of the podcast is Everything is Alive. There was a little music in the background, not much, but we heard the plucking of some strings. And also, something interesting about this podcast was it kind of started off in medias res. We heard the elevator talking, and then we kind of heard the host introduce the elevator as the interview subject for the podcast. So every now and then we see a little of that going on with podcasting. Let me familiarize you with another podcast. Okay, this podcast, not going to make you listen to it, but it's a daily podcast, Monday through Friday, Marketplace Tech Report, and basically it's a 5 to 7 minute podcast about what's going on with technology. So it's oftentimes the first thing I listen to in the morning, and helps me get going as I'm doing my morning routine on the computer. The host for the show, Molly Wood, she used to have a podcast hosted by CNET. It was called BuzzFeed. And so she's a very knowledgeable tech reporter, and also kind of humorous, easy to listen to, good insights. Just about every episode involves an interview with someone in tech. So if you're into that sort of thing, this is a good podcast to listen to, and I've linked it up as a recommended podcast. Okay, this grouping of podcasts, Radio Diaries, Radio Lab, and Stuff You Should Know, they're just, I think, good podcasts to listen to kind of learn new things. So Radio Diary and Radio Lab tend to focus on stories, and they are created as radio shows and then re-released as podcasts. Stuff You Should Know, I find to be a really interesting podcast. It's about an hour long, and it's two guys talking about a random topic. So they pick something, or their, whoever their student intern or whatever, their production staff, they pick something, and they research it pretty extensively. And then they sit and talk about it for an hour. And you would think that would be pretty boring, especially since they're kind of laid back and low key. And but there's something compelling about the relaxed style that makes you want to listen. And they're pretty humorous as well. And, at the end of 45, 50 minutes of listening to it, you realize I've learned something out of this. So I oftentimes listen to podcasts like this when I'm driving back and forth between Westchester and my home. And so, good listening. I also listen to a lot of music podcasts, but I'm not recommending any of those to you guys at this point. I'm sure you can find those on your own. So, this next group of podcasts, This American Life and To the Best of Our Knowledge, they're both created as radio programs by public radio. And To the Best of Our Knowledge is Wisconsin Public Radio. This American Life is produced in Chicago. I'm not sure what the radio station is, but they deal with compelling issues in American society, and oftentimes they're broken up so that in an hour or so they've got like 3 segments or maybe 4 segments going on. And they also do a lot of things that are very good in terms of podcasting. They capture a lot of ambient audio, so it's not just someone reading or 2 people talking around a microphone. You oftentimes get a sense of place and space by listening to these podcasts. And let me go show them to you a little bit on iTunes so we can kind of look at some of the recent episodes. Okay, so This American Life, some recent episodes. I think they recently changed something about the feed and the format for the show, because we're only seeing like 4 episodes here, but there are a lot more than that. But you've got the description for each, and this one in particular, No Coincidence, No Story, I thought was a really excellent podcast. It's a little over an hour. We can see the description here. We asked listeners to send us their best coincidence stories, and we got more than 1,300 submissions. There were so many good ones, we decided to make a whole show about them. From a chance encounter at a bus station, to a romantic dollar bill, to a baffling apparition in a college shower stall. So, these are, interesting, rather humorous stories. You've probably experienced this coincidence feeling in your life, that things have magically happened at the same time, and this kind of explores a lot of that. And it's also well produced, good podcast. So I give this No Coincidence, No Story episode, I'd give it 5 stars. It's one that I would strongly encourage you to find some time to listen to. So okay, and then let's take a look at To the Best of Our Knowledge. Also, you'll notice that people who have subscribed to whatever podcast you're listening to on iTunes, they'll say listeners also subscribe to. And so this is a good way if you say, oh, I like that series, I wish there was more. You can find others like it. So, okay, hang on a second. Okay, so this is what I'm kind of used to seeing when I go to This American Life, a really long list of episodes. But this is To the Best of Our Knowledge from Wisconsin Public Radio. And I don't think I've done it yet, but I'm going to link up this episode, Listening to the City, link it up to our D2L site, because it is just chock full of what I'm calling audio artifacts that you can include in your podcast. And you'll see how it provides a lot of depth and sense of space and place. So, and look through some of these others, see if you find something that interests you, give it a listen. It's free. If you don't like it after the first few seconds or the first couple of minutes, move on to something else. So, but again, a very professional production, and but not something that's beyond us, with a fairly simple setup. So, okay, let me go back to my slides. Okay, and then the last recommended podcast that I had in my list that's going on D2L, Westchester Story Slam. This is created here in Westchester, and basically what it is, I'm sure you're familiar with poetry slams and story slams and stuff. So people show up somewhere in Westchester, I can't remember the exact location. They sign up saying that they want to tell a story, and then you get up on stage and you tell a story in front of a bunch of people, and at the end of the evening they decide first, second, third place or something, and then they typically put together a podcast with first, second, and third place stories that were told. So and you can listen to the podcast. If you like even more stories, you could sign up for the event, go and just listen. You don't have to sign up to tell a story. You can just go and listen. And they're once a month in downtown Westchester. And typically when they announce the next month's one, so here we are in October, they've probably announced November, or they're going to do it soon. Tickets sell fast. People seem to enjoy these story slams. So if you're into that sort of thing, give it a listen, and either online or in person. Okay. And moving on, creating a podcast, it's a very simple process. I gave you a little brief demo of Audacity the other day. I also created a tutorial on using Audacity. I also uploaded another really short tutorial from CNET on using Audacity. So more information on that will be forthcoming, but here are the materials you basically kind of need. You could probably get by just with Audacity, but since we're frequently gathering audio artifacts on the go, your phone is a tool that you can use to create podcasts. Use the little voice memo feature on your phone, and maybe you're recording your own voice, you're thinking something, you want to capture it, or you hear something as a sound effect. Oftentimes, the sound of a space. You can imagine a gymnasium has its own space, a concert hall has its own sound. We can actually hear the size of that space when you capture that type of ambient noise. So don't overlook just the ambient noise, the background noise. It doesn't have to be people talking the whole time. Okay. And then with your phone, I talk about these conversion programs, and I've linked a couple of them up. So basically, you have the audio file on your phone as a voice memo, and you can use the share function to, you could put it on Facebook or something if you wanted to, but most of the time, this is not what we're doing it for, but you have the option to email it. And so email it to yourself, and then you'll have that voice memo in your email, and then we'll convert it into a format that you can use in Audacity. Also, I mentioned already, creating a podcast, you'd need to sign up with a hosting site, but we're not doing this for this assignment. And then if you're really serious about this, you're going to want to have a good microphone, but it's not critical. Just sitting in front of your laptop and talking to it, reading your paper, you should have good quality audio. You can also, as we talked about already, use your phone for this to record audio. So, okay, so here, kind of an important slide. A typical podcast structure in terms of the podcast that we're putting together. But so to start with, we kind of have, so as you're writing your essay, you're writing an introduction and then the body, and you're going to have a conclusion. But even before the introduction to your essay, if you're converting this to a podcast, there's a separate introduction. There's the show intro, which is going to be 30 seconds or less, typically recorded separately and then used over and over and over again. And you just drop that into Audacity, the previously recorded file, and follow that little CNET tutorial that I linked up. Typically, the show intro will have some intro music, and then we'll hear the host, and then he or she will say, on today's episode, blah, blah, blah. So kind of introducing the topic. And then after that, we kind of go into your essay as the program. So we're doing a pretty simplified podcast, so to speak. Oftentimes, podcasts have several different segments in them, but we just have one main program. And so you're going to read your introduction, your body conclusion. You're going to add in audio effects where you want. You can have some background music and such. And we pretty much come to the conclusion of the essay, and then we back out pretty much in reverse of how we got into it. We have a show outro. And I say, yes, that is a regular term used in podcasting. Again, this is typically recorded separately. It oftentimes mirrors the intro. We hear the host come back on. They wrap up that episode. They oftentimes preview or announce what the next episode will be. And then oftentimes, the host will stop talking and we get another 10, 20 seconds of music, and then it's done. So we are going to work on recording the show intro and outro separately. And then we're also going to record your essay, add in those audio effects, and then piece the whole thing together. So it's pretty simple. Okay, so I did want to play you some student examples of this assignment from previous semester. So hang with me a little bit on that. Let me get those queued up. Okay, so I've got an episode queued up here. All you're seeing is what's here at the top. Ignore everything that's going on down here, and let's just take a listen to how this podcast starts. And so we're going to hear music, and then the host, and then we're going to go into the essay after that. So take a listen.
Hello, and welcome back to the Westchester Eats podcast, episode 14. Today we'll be featuring a popular diner in town called Market Street Grill. When walking around Westchester, there are many options when considering where to get food.
Okay, so just the first 30 seconds here, and we had the music come in, we had the show, the host, welcome, and then he kind of previewed what was going on. He also said this is episode 14, which, I like it kind of when students can kind of conceptualize this as part of an overall series and not just kind of a standalone podcast. So imagine the series, and then talk about Market Street Grill. And then there was a little pause there, and then he said, when walking through Westchester, finding a place to eat, blah, blah, blah. So there's actually a little part where we wrap up the show intro, and then we have the essay intro. And it pretty much ends the same way, so I'm not going to make you listen to a whole lot more. Let me find another example to share with you. Okay, so I've got another episode queued up from a different student. And again, we're going to get some music and the host intro, and that'll last about 30 seconds, and then we go into the program.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome back to another week of Golden Ram Talent, the official podcast for the odd jobs and unique personalities of Westchester University.
Okay, so the music kind of ended abruptly, and then we got the host welcome, and he announced it as part of a regular podcast series. And so then he's going to interview some of his friends who are members of a band, and that's pretty much the podcast. So he's profiling the band. Okay, let me find another example for you. Okay, this one's interesting because the student's writing about the outdoor classroom at Westchester. And so instead of intro music, we have some captured audio from outdoors. So you hear the sounds of birds and such. A really good intro. Unfortunately, once we get into the program, the audio drops. And so we'll have to kind of stop there. But let me let you hear the intro.
Hi everyone, this is
Today I have a profile of a location on West Chester University's campus that has a great deal of benefit to the university and its population, the outdoor classroom.
Okay, so you couldn't hear the student very well, but you could hear the bird sounds pretty well. Let me see if I can find another example for you. Okay, so here's another example. It has some really nice intro music, but unfortunately we don't get a show intro along with that intro music. Instead, the intro music plays for about 30 seconds and stops, and then the student starts reading their essay. So let's go ahead and have a listen just for 30 seconds.
What comes to mind when somebody tells you they are a musician? There are a lot of...
Okay, so there's just a little bit of overlap between the music and the host talking about that episode. So I think it's better to overlap it a bit more and think of the intro as a standalone part of the show, and the outro too, and then your essay in the middle. Okay, let me find another example. Okay, so this particular podcast is about audio essay is about cheerleading at West Chester University. So the writer takes advantage of the topic by putting us into this situation. So we don't necessarily have a series show opener, but we have a nice opener for this particular episode, and we get to hear the gymnasium sounds and the sounds of the cheerleading. So let's take a listen.
Hi, and welcome back. My name is Danielle. This is Rainbows, episode 11. Night.
Okay, so we kind of got the opening, and then we got the host welcoming us to the show after that, and then going into the essay again after that. So again, the audio kind of dropped off after the intro, so we won't listen to any more of that. Let me see if I have one or two more examples. Okay, so in this example, we get the intro music, and I think it's maybe a little slow. We want to get the readers or the listeners interested. We don't want to, encourage them to go to sleep or anything. And the music actually ends, and then the host talks for a few minutes as the show intro, and then we finally get into the essay. So again, it's kind of slow, but I'm going to go ahead and play it. Hang in there with me.
Hey folks, and welcome back to Talking Dub C, where we talk about all the interesting facets that make West Chester University so amazing. So once again, this is your host, Dan Doherty, and today I'm here to talk to you about the newest phenomenon here on campus, Tap and Go.
Okay, so there's the intro for that, and let me see if I have another example for you. Okay, I'll make this my last student example. This is a student who obviously figured out that I'm a fan of the Grateful Dead, so that's the intro music. And then we get the welcome and kind of a brief announcement of what the episode is about. and then we get into the essay at that point. So let's take a quick listen.
Trucking, got my chips cashed in, keep trucking, like the Doodah Man, together, more or less in line, just keep trucking on.
Hi, and welcome back to the weekly Westchester podcast with Jamie. In today's spotlight, we have the manager of the WCU men's ice hockey team. Westchester University is home to many clubs, sports teams, Greek life, and other organizations.
Okay, so good audio, good intro, and this is a profile of someone with an unusual job, and so she kind of mentions that. Today we have with us someone with the Westchester, did you say volleyball team? I can't remember, men's hockey team, and then we get this, Westchester has many different, clubs and sports and activities. So that's the actual beginning of the essay at that point. So we got a pretty good show intro, and now we're into the essay. And again, as I said before, ignore all this, what's happening below on iTunes. This just happened to be the page I was on, and when I loaded these student examples. So let me go back to my lecture notes. Okay, so just a few more things to talk about here. Basically, I'm encouraging you to start listening to audio as text and how audio can be used to tell a story. So not just someone speaking, but that just like we used images in the first essay as text to help tell our story, here we're going to be using, with this assignment, audio as text to help tell our story. So start listening to sounds around you, become an active listener. One thing I encourage you to do is think about what are some typical sounds that college students are familiar with. So maybe the vibration of your phone, the alarm in the morning, different things you hear around campus, classes changing, depending on how many of you still use notebooks, there's that sound of the 3-ring binder being popped open and popped closed, and maybe some sounds of, Starbucks or other things going on. And then we also had gymnasium sounds and football stadium sounds, and so all sorts of sounds around you, and start taking note of these sounds. They could be audio artifacts that you use later. I'm also encouraging you to try capturing some audio artifacts with your phone using the Voice Memo app. And I talked again about use the share function to send the voice memo to yourself as an email attachment. Use these conversion programs that I've listed on our D2L site to convert them into MP3 files so you can work with them in Audacity. And then open them up on Audacity and practice editing the audio files, applying special effects, and in the process familiarizing yourself with Audacity. Okay, and for this particular assignment that we're working on, we're focusing on the written part at this point, but I do want you to start, once you've settled on a topic, start gathering audio artifacts for your topic. I'm going to set up a D2L discussion and ask you to upload some of these audio artifacts related to your topic, and we're going to try to see how the audio tells a story. So I think those are my notes on this assignment at this point. I'm sorry that this is a fairly lengthy video lecture. I try to avoid that, but had a bunch of stuff I needed to cover, and hopefully you made it through it. You can always stop and start at different points. So if you missed some of it, again, go back and listen to those bits. And so I tried to turn you on to some interesting podcasts to listen to and show you or share with you examples of student work and try to get you thinking more about this assignment. So we're going to continue with this brainstorming, discovery draft process. But, after you get settled on a topic, start tuning your ears in to different things that you could use as audio effects in your essay. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll be talking to you again soon.